I'll start with a kind of autobiographical reflection. When I was preparing for my entry exam to philosophical studies in Krakow, I was given a list of books, and I had to choose one of these books in order to talk about it at the interview. And in this list of books which I had to choose, there were two books. The first was Roman Ingarden's Książeczka o człowieku, a little book about a man, and Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz's Zagadnienia i kierunki philosophy, problems and directions of philosophy. And I started to read both of these books and decided to choose Ajdukiewicz's book for my entry exam. Let's say that this adolescence choice reflects also my present preferences, philosophical preferences, because I'm closer to the Lvov-Warsaw school than to Roman Ingarden. Of course, then after some years, I read Ingarden's book on men once again, and I appreciate this book very much. But at that time, it was Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz's philosophy that was more interesting to me. And now coming to the main subject of my paper. The aim of my paper is to provide a certain methodological comparison between the Lvov-Warsaw school and the philosophy of Roman Ingarden. And I'd like to provide justification for two theses. Firstly, that from the methodological point of view, Ingarden cannot be counted among members of the Lvov-Warsaw school. Of course, Ingarden usually is not counted among the members of the school, but I would like to provide some explicit justification for this claim. And secondly, that on the other hand, there are certain elements of Ingarden's methodological attitude that make the, let's call it so, intellectual contact between the members of the school and Ingarden possible. Some reservations has to be made here because I present the Lvov-Warsaw school as a methodological unity. However, we have to be aware that it's a certain simplification. There were different ways of doing philosophy also within the school. So only on some general level, we may say that this methodology of the school was something steady and common to all members of the school. Second reservation, in the comparison, I try to omit the terminological differences between the philosophers in question and conceptual chaos connected with that. However, it is not always possible to avoid this conceptual misunderstandings. And finally, I try to present Ingarden's views not in the Ingardenian language, as I am convinced that if something can be presented in one language, then it can be also presented in another one. However, again, it's not always possible, so sometimes I will refer to Ingarden's original terms and language. And the plan of my paper is the following. I start with some comments of interpersonal relations between Roman Ingarden and members of the school. Of course, Jan Woleński provided some introduction, some historical reflections yesterday, but I would like to add some elements to this picture of these relations. Secondly, I would like to present shortly the Lvov-Warsaw school from methodological point of view. Thirdly, in the third point, I would like to compare Roman Ingarden's methodological attitudes versus the Lvov-Warsaw school methodological paradigm. And then I will focus on one element of this paradigm of the Lvov-Warsaw school, namely the analysis of concepts in the Lvov-Warsaw school. And I would like to compare it with Ingarden's so-called cognition of essences. And in the end, I would like to make a short comment concerning the so-called explicit methodology and implicit methodology based on example of Ingarden's analysis of musical composition. And I will end with some closing remarks. So let's now move to the first part, Roman Ingarden and members of the Warsaw School, interpersonal relations. There are many sources of our knowledge about interpersonal relations among some group of people, among some philosophers. There are some explicit statements, there are letters, but here we've got only, let's say, visual, visual representation of these relations. Here we may see the Lvov-Warsaw school, namely Twardowski and his students, in the 1920s, about 1924. And here we see, I hope that you can see my cursor, Kazimierz Twardowski is sitting here. Here we may see Roman Ingarden, and here Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz. And I think the body language of Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz represents perfectly the attitude of the members of the Lvov-Warsaw school towards Roman Ingarden. No comments is needed here. So these relations were quite complicated, as already Jan Woleński presented yesterday, but let me add some comments to that. Firstly, the relations between Roman Ingarden and Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz were complicated, but at some level quite well. For instance, Ingarden called Ajdukiewicz in one of his letters to Twardowski his closest colleague and friend. The relations between Ingarden and the representatives of Warsaw Logic Group, especially Kotarbiński and Leśniewski, were much more strained. What made the situation even more difficult were strong personalities of people in question. Ingarden was a very self-confident man, and not without justification, of course. He believed in his own philosophical competences, and he couldn't believe that he is not as much appreciated as he wanted to be. Also, Ingarden had a feeling of being not understood and underestimated by his Lvov and Warsaw colleagues. He often emphasized his loneliness and isolation. And here we go with some exemplifications from Ingarden's and others' letters. Ingarden wrote to Twardowski on October 26, 1919. It seems that the publication of this book, it was a book on aspirations of phenomenologists, would be useful in view of the confusion concerning the aspirations of phenomenologists, as well as aversion to study the original works of Husserl and his student, I mean the one student Ingarden. Second quotation from 1952, a letter of Ingarden to Domska, Isadora Domska. Members of the so-called Lvov-Warsaw school have emotional resistance to phenomenology, which makes them unable to start reading my books. And that was Ingarden's feeling, but Domska answered, I think that you are wrong, judging that members of the Lvov-Warsaw school do not read you. I think so by myself. After all, I am a poor and unimportant member of the Twardowski's Lvov school. So hated today, probably she had in mind here this hate by communist authorities, which removed her from the university. However, I know many of your earlier works, and I read your controversy over the existence of the word before you were so kind to give me this book to me. Of course, I am far from a good knowledge of controversy and many other works of yours, but I think that both me and other people of the school read you. So now let's move to the second point, the Lvov-Warsaw school from methodological point of view, and I will present in short the methodological characteristics of the Lvov-Warsaw school, and this presentation is based, of course, partially on works of other scholars, but such as Jan Woleński and Jacek Jadacki, but first of all based on my own research, which I conducted in last 3 years with my younger colleagues, Marcin Będkowski, Stepan Iwanek, Dominik Traczykowski, and Alicja Chybińska, and this research concerned the methodology of the Lvov-Warsaw school. So some general remarks concerning the methodology of philosophy in the school. Firstly, all members of the school concerned philosophy as a science, at least in the broader meaning of the word science. And that meant that they accepted and fulfilled some elementary criteria of science, the postulate of clarity of expressions and the postulate of proper justification of views. The postulate of clarity is aimed at all manifestations of vaguenesses and cause of misunderstanding and unending disputes in philosophical disciplines. And the weapon in the fight against vagueness is mostly language analysis, since language is a tool of thinking and cognition and interpersonal communication. And now, according to the postulate of proper justification, a claim, a certain thesis must not be accepted with greater force than its justification allows. Acceptance sources of cognition are experience, extant introspection, and reasoning. Some members of the school accepted also some kinds of intuition, especially in the sphere of values. Intuition of values was something important for some members of the school. And some more important features of attitude of members of the school towards philosophy. They accepted the thesis about active role of language in cognition. Namely, they were convinced that various languages, natural, artificial, philosophical languages, can be treated as the point of departure of philosophical investigations. And then they believe that traditional philosophical problems are meaningful and that they may be solved or at least clarified and responsibly posed. And of course, the last but not least, the very important thing that they, in order to solve the philosophical problems or make them clearer, they use broadly understood logic. This broad conception of logic included formal logic, semiotics, and methodology of sciences, and they use these logical tools as the philosophical organon. And coming to some specific matters, there are three most important methods of philosophy practiced in the Lvov-Warsaw school, namely analysis of concepts, paraphrase of claims, paraphrase of theses, and axiomatization of theories. The analysis of concepts aims to provide a given term, which is a correlate of concept with a definition. Paraphrase of sentences is a procedure that aims to establish the logical value of a given philosophical thesis. But in this establishing the logical value of a thesis, we've got an important element, an important step, which consists in formulating a paraphrase that is a kind of an equivalent of the initial thesis in a certain specific language. So this method of paraphrases in most general sense consists in such a thing. And finally, we've got axiomatization of theories. And the aim of axiomatization in philosophy is to guarantee a major form for philosophical theories, to analyze reasonings, finally to derive consequences of the assumed thesis. And the stages of axiomatization in Łukasiewicz formulation from 1920 are selecting of primary terms, indicating axioms, defining derivative terms with primary terms, deriving important theses from axioms, comparing the results of research with data from intuition, from the natural sciences, and from experience. And now let's look at Ingarden's attitude towards these elements of methodology of philosophy mentioned in this presentation of the Lvov-Warsaw school paradigm. First, the conception of philosophy. What was common to members of the Lvov-Warsaw school and Roman Ingarden was the conviction of the significance of philosophy and meaningfulness of philosophical problems. I would raise a hypothesis that this was a strong influence of Franz Brentano here, because of course Brentano was a teacher of both Twardowski and Husserl, and Ingarden was a student of both Twardowski and Husserl. In fact, relations between Ingarden and Twardowski were complicated, at least in some phases, but still he called Twardowski a person that revealed him the philosophical world and inculcated the love for philosophy into him. Now the problem of clarity. So this first postulate, which was accepted and propagated by members of the school. I know that my colleague Wojtek Rechlewicz will talk about this problem of clarity in Ingarden and Twardowski, so I will only say some few short things about it. As we know, the school of Twardowski was the school of clarity, and Twardowski was famous for his ability to present any philosophical problem in a clear manner. And in the paper on clear and unclear philosophical style, it was manifesto, let's say, of Twardowski's attitude, and he expressed the view: if X writes unclearly, then X thinks unclearly. So we do not have to make any effort to try to understand unclear philosophical papers. And Ingarden reacted to this, responded to this paper. He wrote an article in Philosophical Movement, but he also wrote about it in letters to Twardowski, and I will quote this Ingarden's letter. In my article on clear style, I tried to pay attention to conditions which have to be fulfilled by the reader of a philosophical text, assuming that the philosopher author thinks clearly. I wanted to emphasize that some peculiar philosophical works require special skills of the reader in order to be clear. And this was my intention because I was often confronted with the fact that some works were considered not understandable, while they were only not understood. So this is why Ingarden felt not understood. And for sure, Ingarden was thinking here about some of his own writings. And this is another quotation from Ingarden's letters to Twardowski about one of his papers. A few days ago, I met Professor Kotarbiński, who found and read the manuscript of Aspirations of Phenomenologists. However, he states that he does not understand it and is against the publication. So there is another justification for this difficult relation between Ingarden and Kotarbiński, for instance. And the problem was the lack of clarity of Ingarden's writings. But on the other hand, we may observe in the development of Ingarden's philosophy that the level of clarity was rising in his writings, and to some degree it was probably because of these contacts with representatives of the Lvov-Warsaw school. The second thing, the postulate of justification. Well, the estimation whether a given philosopher fulfills the postulate of justification depends on which kinds of justifications one considers acceptable. And let me repeat that in the Lvov-Warsaw school, there were two accepted sources of knowledge, of cognition: experience, including extrospection or introspection, and reasoning. And by phenomenologists, there were something else. Phenomenologists claim that there is another source of direct cognition, namely phenomenological cognition, direct access to the world of ideas. And this claim was for sure not commonly accepted by members of the school. What was the problem with this phenomenological cognition? The problem consists in the lack of intersubjectivity of this kind of cognition and the relation between language and cognition, which was not so stressed by phenomenologists as by so-called analytic groups. And what is interesting, in the letters of Twardowski to Ingarden, Twardowski never uses this term phenomenological method, with only one exception. In one letter of Twardowski to Ingarden, he wrote, "I am curious about what you would write in this review." It was about the review of a phenomenological Jahrbuch, about the tragedy of phenomenological method that is revealed in the dissertation of Mr. Konrad Martinus. And this was written in the letter to Ingarden, and unfortunately, Ingarden didn't answer to this provocation of Twardowski. And now let's concentrate on these three peculiar methods of philosophy that were practiced, applied in the Lvov-Warsaw school, namely axiomatization, paraphrase, and analysis of concepts. For sure, Ingarden did not apply axiomatization. It seems, however, that Twardowski advises Ingarden to try to apply mathematical logic, because Ingarden wrote in a letter in 1917, "Concerning my possible work in the domain of formal logic, for now no question arose to me, and generally I am not courageous enough to start these things, since the very object from formal logical questions as well as the formal approach to them, is in fact alien to me. So alien that I would have to conduct longer studies in order to drill myself to this kind of work and questions. And let me add that after the World War II, Ingarden paid attention to the possibilities of formal logic and assessed these possibilities very severely. His main objection to formal logicians can be reduced to the fact that they are deprived of intuition of essence. They construct blindly formal systems that do not find any real application in the description of reality. And let's stress that this criticism of formal methods was something that connects Ingarden with Twardowski's, who expressed his views in his Symbolomania and Pragmatophobia. Concerning the method of paraphrase, I will not concentrate on that, but let me only state that members of the Lvov-Warsaw school noticed that at this very important phase of the method of the using of method of paraphrase, which consists in justification of paraphrase, because in the method of paraphrase we've got two different languages. We try to formulate, let's say, the same thesis in two different languages, and we have to justify somehow that these two theses formulated in two different languages are somehow equivalent. So, for instance, Ajdukiewicz was convinced that somehow we may use phenomenological method in order to justify this step of the method of paraphrases. Okay, so let me only let me skip this this slide because I would like to concentrate on other matters. Let's only remember about this justification of paraphrase and the use of phenomenological method in this process. And now the following point. I would like to concentrate on the problem of analysis of concepts, establishing the essences and providing definitions. In my opinion, these procedures can be somehow compared, connected. In my opinion, the most interesting analogies may be found between Ingarden's philosophical methods and the procedure of analysis of concepts applied in the Lvov-Warsaw school. Let me compare these three quotations. Firstly, from the letter of Ingarden to Twardowski. He wrote about what is philosophy, what's the essence of philosophy, and he wrote, concerning the essence of philosophy, in fact, I am convinced that philosophy consists in a systematic examination, first of all, based on direct cognition, the essences of all objects. Now another quotation from the program paper of Ajdukiewicz, presented at Paris Congress. Ajdukiewicz wrote, the school of Twardowski, emphasizing clarity of thought, directed its main efforts towards conceptual analysis. And finally, there's the third quotation from Tadeusz Czyżowski's, so also Twardowski's student, paper on so-called analytic description, which was his term for analytic method simply. Czyżowski wrote, analytic method provides the analytic definition of a described object through its specific or typical qualities, even if it is not a sentence in the form of characteristic of a definition. And it is, therefore, a semantic analysis of the name of the described object. So in my opinion, establishing the essences of objects in phenomenological spirit is an analog of analyzing concepts or establishing definitions of terms in the analytic tradition. But there are some differences I would like to point to. Now about the analysis of concepts in the Lvov-Warsaw school, I will present it very shortly, the most important facts about this analysis. Firstly, the analysis of concepts in different forms and in different shapes was practiced by all members of the Lvov-Warsaw school. Usually Twardowski encouraged his students to make some analysis of concepts as their dissertations and so on. And there are many examples of such analysis as main subject of thesis or secondary subject. So it was really everywhere among members of the school. It was present everywhere. It was a common element despite the fact that members of the Lvov-Warsaw school had different views about what concepts are. The procedure of analysis was something relatively steady in the school and survived the semiotic turn and methodological switch from descriptive psychology to logic. The crucial thing is to accept that the concepts are senses of terms and that they can be given in definitions. And this claim was already accepted by Twardowski to some degree, let's say, and sustained in all generations of the school. And the procedure of analysis was not only practiced in the Lvov-Warsaw school, but it was also systematized by members of the school. And these systematizations include Łukasiewicz analysis and construction of the concept of cause, a very, very early paper from 1906, Czerzowski's papers of analytic description, but also many works concerning the theory of definitions, because if we concern definition as a final point of analysis, we may analyze the process of analysis of concepts from the point of view of definitions as the results. What were the steps of analysis of concepts in the Lvov-Warsaw school? At first, one indicates the corpus of analysis, and there are two types of corpuses, material and verbal. Material corpuses are selected instantiations of concepts. Verbal corpus includes selected context in which the carrier of the concept occurs. I will explain these terms in a minute on the next slide. Then in the second step, corpus data are examined and compared in order to indicate the search components of concept. And the crucial point here is to indicate the ontic category of the instantiations of the concept and or the language category of the carriers of the concept. In the first step, what indicates tools of analysis, for instance, elements of set theory, classical logical calculi, semiotic distinctions, and so on. One indicates or creates the conceptual scheme into which the analyzed concept is to be included. And then in the fourth step, one indicates the elements of the analyzed concept in the form of firstly, provisional definition. It is the moment in which these elements, these factors, the chosen corpus, the conceptual background, and analytic intentions have to be harmonized. Usually at this step in the Lvov-Warsaw school, there were some reconstructive elements present. So the analysis of concepts includes some reconstructive elements. We are not only, let's say, looking for elements given in this concept, but we try to reconstruct it because usually terms are used vaguely and we have to establish the new meaning of the concept. So we need these reconstructive elements at this step. And of course, in this process of forming definitions, one may make use of various forms of definitions, and classical definitions is applied only on special occasions. In the fifth step of the analysis of concepts, one tests whether the definition fulfills the criteria, for instance, whether it covers all and only elements of the corpora, whether it possesses appropriate formal qualities, whether it fits well to the conceptual scheme. And if necessary, the whole procedure is repeated if for some reasons the result of the analysis is not satisfactory. Now some distinctions are needed in order to show why the procedure of analysis in the Lvov-Warsaw school was possible despite all this evolution of methodological attitudes. Let us agree that we've got certain definitions, like Aristotelian definitions of human being as a rational animal, and we've got then some individual objects, as for instance Roman Ingarden, sets of individual objects, for instance set of all and only human beings, properties indicating set free, so properties that indicate this set, so for instance being animal and being rational. 5 ideal substrates of properties, for instance, men as such, language expressions or terms, for instance, a man, designata of X, for instance, Ingarden, denotations or extensions of 6, for instance, set of all and only human beings, and finally connotations of 6, for instance, being animal and being rational. And when we look at this whole distinctions, we may easily find out that some elements on this list may be identified. For instance, individual objects are designator of names, sets of individual objects are denotations of names, and finally properties, essential properties or just properties indicating some sets may be identified as connotations of terms. So this way we may see how the switch into semiotic attitude to concepts was possible in the Lvov-Warsaw school. Of course, there were also concepts in, let's say, psychological sense. For instance, Twardowski would consider every of these objects as an object of his presentation, but let's keep this problem to another meeting. And now, the most important thing is that members of the school were convinced that the only way to know something about the concepts is to know something about the carriers of the concepts or instantiations of the concepts. For instance, we've got the concept of man. Carriers of the concept are just terms man appearing in different contexts, and instantiations of concepts are real men, such as Roman Ingarden. So, for instance, Ajdukiewicz believed that he may know something about the concept of man through the analysis of the occurrences of the carriers of the concepts, or through analysis of instantiations of the concept, but no direct access to the concepts is possible. And by Ingarden, it looked quite differently, and now I have to use these original terms of Ingarden. By Ingarden, there were, of course, individual human beings, and there was also idea of human being and the content of idea of human being, and individual human beings are exemplified by individual human beings. Now we've got perception of individual human being and ideation. So that is this intuition of essences, and this kind of cognition goes directly to the content of the idea. So we may somehow know these essences directly. So I think I have just a little amount of time, so I will skip these things and I will move to the most important fact. Yeah. So the most important fact is that Ingarden accepted this direct cognition of essences. In the Lvov-Warsaw school terminology, he believed that there is something like direct cognition of concepts, and this thesis was not accepted in the school. But on the other hand, when we look at what Ingarden really did in his writings, we may observe that what he did was quite similar to what the members of the Warsaw School did in their works, their analysis of concepts. For instance, if we look at Ingarden's work on musical composition, we may easily see that, in fact, Ingarden makes use of some material corpus. So he analyzes some simple examples of musical compositions, and the verbal corpus, because he includes some statements about musical compositions and makes analysis of that. And I think it's quite similar in other Ingarden's works. And closing remarks. Firstly, the analysis of concepts provided by members of the Lvov-Warsaw School contains some constructive elements and are relativized to given conceptual schemes and given aims. So thus, for instance, if two different definitions of, let's say, the same concept are provided by representatives of the school, they may be equally good, these two different definitions, because they are relativized to different aims and they are relativized to different conceptual schemes. But if two different phenomenological analyses of essences are provided, one of these analyses has to be erroneous. This is the difference between this attitude of Ingarden to essences and the attitude of Lvov-Warsawians, let's say, to the analysis of concepts. So from the methodological point of view, Ingarden was not a member of the school, first of all, because he accepted the kind of cognition which was doubtful from the point of view of members of the school. And Ingarden's examination of the essence may be considered as pre-axiomatic procedure and may be compared to the analysis of concepts, which was commonly applied in the school. And only three quotations in the end. The first comes from Bocheński, who wrote, "Ontology, the way it is practiced today, say by Hartmann, Sartre, or Ingarden, is simply an introduction to formal logic." Second quotation of Ajdukiewicz, "What phenomenologists call the intuition of essences may also be called careful scrutiny of the meaning of words, wżywanie się w znaczenie wyrazu. Statements based on the latter only explicate the meaning of the terms contained in them, and so are analytic statements." And finally, Tatarkiewicz's opinion. Let's remember that Tatarkiewicz was also incorporated into the school. He declared himself to be close to Lvov philosophers, and also Ajdukiewicz mentions him as representative of the school. And Tatarkiewicz's diagnosis was the following: phenomenology in the most important point and systematically and consistently until the end of making distinctions seems to me closest to the methods used by Professor Twardowski and the Lvov-Warsaw school. So I hope this gives us something to think, and thank you for attention.
Thank you for the presentation. We have 5-6 minutes for discussion. Peter Simon's first question.
Thank you, Anna. It was very enlightening. In many ways, I think it's one of the big tragedies of Polish philosophy that Ingarden and the representatives of the school did not get on so well, especially in the 1920s and 30s. There was obviously a little bit of personal fault on both sides, but in terms of the methodology, the reason why I would side with the Lvov-Warsaw school and against Ingarden is the phenomenological method of intuition of essences that Ingarden took over from or learned from Husserl makes it very difficult to do two things. One is to rationally discuss intersubjectively differences in intuitions between phenomenologists who see things differently. And secondly, because it's supposed to be in some way or other infallible, you don't have this ability to progressively refine analyses or change things as you go along, as you find more out, which is built into this kind of recursive or repetitive element in the Lvov-Warsaw school's method that you highlighted. So I mean, sub specie eternitatis, I think the fault is on the side of Husserl and the phenomenologists much more than it is on the side of the Lvov-Warsaw school, although I do agree with Twardowski that just mucking around with formal systems for the sake of it doesn't get you anywhere near to solving philosophical problems. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I completely agree that the lack of intersubjectivity and the lack of possibility to repeat this kind of cognition are the most important things. But I think that after the Second World War, Ingarden didn't repeat it so intensively, this importance of phenomenological cognition. So,
Right. Thank you. Guillaume, Proszę.
Okay, yes, well, thanks. I liked your remark about Twardowski answering to Reinach about Konrad Martius and naming her Mr. So probably didn't know much about
sorry, yeah. In fact,
okay.
I didn't check it, yeah.
No, but what I find interesting, well, or perhaps like characteristic of this time is that, as you said, it is the Jahrbuch. It is a review of the Jahrbuch, and the Jahrbuch is some kind of programmatic, phenomenological journal. So they are all convinced that they are like defending a special method. And I mean, given the fact that Twardowski is also a student of Brentano, and looking at what Husserl's doing and seeing that it's not very different in I mean, okay, Spock speaks of essences, but the basics are all in Brentano. I could understand that Twardowski was a bit ironic by using the word phenomenological method, because it's basically, I mean, when you look at descriptive psychology, it includes also generalization. Of course, you can talk of intuition of essences if you're Husserl and if you want to really sell your own private school somehow, but it's very similar. I mean, in structure, of course, there are differences. What I just want to say by this is that perhaps Ingarden was just unlucky, was just not at the right time, because otherwise it would have had perhaps a better reception among the people of the Lvov-Warsaw school.
Well, yes. I don't know whether Jan would confirm, but I think early works of Husserl were appreciated in the Warsaw School by Twardowski and especially by Jan Łukasiewicz, yes, because it was one of reasons that they refuted psychologism in the Warsaw School. But later works were, let's say, estimated differently. But I think that in Twardowski's letters, I see, at least I think he tried to understand what Ingarden wanted to do. And I think Twardowski understood the aspirations of Ingarden's philosophy. So I think this methodological controversies were the strongest between Ingarden and Kotarbiński. And I think the reason were the ontological intuitions, very strict by Kotarbiński because he was a realist, yes, one categorical ontology, and on the other hand, very, let's say, rich ontology of Ingarden. So I think not really the method, but this ontological intuitions played a crucial role in this not well relations between them.
Right, thank you. And the last question, Professor Wolański.
A small detail about Ingarden and Leśniewski. I remember from Ingarden's seminars that of course, he was against Leśniewski and this analysis of abstract objects or general. However, he once said that Leśniewski was the most demanding polemist, so it was almost impossible to deceive him. So even if Ingarden didn't agree with Leśniewski, so he was full of respect for polemical abilities of Leśniewski. And still one remark about Husserl and so on. According to Łukasiewicz, but it was known from diary edited much later. However, Łukasiewicz, and I think that this view was accepted or shared by Lvov-Warsaw School, that everything what was good in Husserl, early Husserl, in first volume of Investigations, it was Frege, and then Husserl moved to typical German philosophical blah, blah, blah. I don't say that it is correct, but it was, I think, quite shared by other members of the Lvov-Warsaw School. And I think it was also a shadow in which they looked at Ingarden, and of course it changed after war.
Yes, well, thank you. What I would like to add, I think that at the same time, Ingarden and Ajdukiewicz went to Husserl and studied under Husserl, and I think that Ajdukiewicz estimation of Husserl was quite low. On the other hand, Ajdukiewicz tried to get into the contact with phenomenological method because, for instance, in these problems of philosophy, he described phenomenological methods, and I think it is a great description, one of the best descriptions of this method. So Ajdukiewicz tried to do it, to understand it, and in fact, in some ways, Ajdukiewicz in his methodological papers tried to indicate places in which phenomenological method would be needed. For instance, in this justification of paraphrase, and on the other hand, Czerzowski indicated that the phenomenological method is sometimes needed when we try to establish this components of concepts. So they agreed that there are some moments in which we can try to use this method, but the problem is this lack of intersubjectivity.
All right, thank you. And I'm afraid we don't have much time for discussion. Thank you once again for the paper and for all questions.